Hello, everybody, and welcome to Comp and Coffee. I am your podcast custodian, Ruth Thomas, and I am Chief Evangelist here at Payscale. We are back discussing gender pay gaps this week. We are recording 2 episodes in March for a specific reason, to talk about our gender pay gap report. March is Women's History Month. It is also the month when we celebrate International Women's Day on March the 8th, and US Equal Pay Day has this year been declared as the 12th of March. So we're taking this opportunity to break down the contents of our recently published gender pay gap report across 2 episodes. Last episode, we talked about the overall outcomes from the gender pay gap research. And in this episode, we're going to be delving more into some of the other report insights and discuss some of the potential drivers of pay gaps. So to help me do that today, I have 2 amazing guests. I'm welcoming back Amy Stewart, our Associate Director of Content. She is back with me. Amy, do you want to say hello?
Hi, thanks everyone for having me back on Comp and Coffee. I'm the Associate Director of Content for Payscale and the author of the 2024 Gender Pay Gap Report. So excited to talk about that today.
Thanks, Amy. And we have another guest who's agreed to join us today, and that is Kelly Campana. Welcome, Kelly. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and tell them your story and how you're interested in this topic?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I am a leadership mindset coach, and I work primarily with women leaders in Fortune 500 across 3 areas: to optimize their mindset, to learn emotional self-regulation, so emotional intelligence, and also energy allocation, and combining those 3 for maximum impact in their careers. I want to clarify, though, when I say leadership, I'm saying anyone who aspires to leadership or who realizes their potential to lead. So very specifically, I'm not looking at titles. I'm not differentiating where anyone sits in the org chart. And we're going to talk about that today, I think, because I think there's a potential for all of us to impact on this issue.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on some of the areas of insight that we discovered while we were writing this report. But Amy, if the audience didn't listen to the last episode, can we get them up to speed? Quick summary on our gender pay gap report. What's it all about? What were the key headline outcomes?
Yes, very quick summary. So Payscale's Gender Pay Gap Report can be found on payscale.com under Research and Insights if you want to take a look at all of the findings, either before, during, or after listening to this podcast. The major headline is the gender pay gap hasn't closed at all since last year, in spite of pay transparency legislation, which began rolling out in 2021. The uncontrolled pay gap is 83 cents to the dollar, and the controlled pay gap is 99 cents, which is the same as last year. For those who are not familiar with those terms, controlled and uncontrolled, uncontrolled is when we're looking at the median pay of women compared to men without accounting for job title, for job level, for other compensable factors that might impact pay. The controlled pay gap, which is what pay transparency legislation really looks to close from a tactical standpoint, is when we're controlling for those job titles. So people getting equal pay for equal or similar work. As usual, we break the data down into different segments, including this year, remote work and job-seeking behavior, which is new. And we find the gender pay gap persists in every way we slice the data. Although it is starting to close in some states, for some occupations, for some industries, and for some minority groups, when data are controlled for job title and other compensable factors. We also look at the opportunity gap, meaning how women move up the career ladder, and our data finds they do so more slowly and in smaller percentages than men. I think we'll take a look at that in particular in today's podcast review.
Great. Thanks, Amy. So Kelly, you've had a chance to read the report now. What's your thoughts kind of at the high level on the outcomes and the general lack of progress that we've seen year over year and that Amy was just talking about then?
Yeah, I'm underwhelmed by how underwhelming the results are, as well as how, I know, Ruth, you did a podcast preview on this late last year, and already, right, we were anticipating this would probably be what happens. And I find that underwhelming that we particularly as women, let's say, right, as professional women, we expect this, despite legislation being passed, despite companies saying that they're going to make strides in this area. And I find this so much in the women that I work with on a day-to-day basis. We have a collective resignation that this is just how it's going to be. And I can summarize it as, I think as women, we believe that we have two options: low pay or no pay. And with that mindset primed in us, I think that we tend to expect little. And we'll talk about this. I think it also influences how little progress we are able to make on an individual level as well as on an organizational level.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's some good thoughts there. And the only way we're really going to break that down and really push this progress, I think, is what we try to do in this report is, look at what are the key drivers. And by cutting the data by age, by job level, by parent status, we can potentially start to identify, why is this happening? Why has progress stalled? So Amy, let's start with age. What trends do we see when we break the data down by age?
Yeah, age is a really interesting one to look at. What we find is that women start their careers earning less than men when data are uncontrolled, and that pay gap only widens as women get older. Between the ages of 20 and 29, women earn 87 cents compared to the $1 that men earn, which is 1 point higher than last year, but that's not really a whole lot to cheer about. And the pay gap widens for women between the ages of 30 and 44, with women earning only 82 cents compared to every $1 that men earn when data are, again, uncontrolled. At 45 and older, the pay gap widens even further for this group. So women's pay increases start to stall from that kind of mid-level career up through the larger career, where they're only making 74 cents on the dollar that men are making. And that hasn't changed at all from last year. So there's different outcomes for the controlled pay gap, but it still shows the overall general trend of, as women are aging, that number gets wider as women get older. One reason that we think this is happening is that women are not employed in jobs that pay as much as men overall. And that includes the jobs they aspire to go into compared to what men aspire to go into. So that's what the uncontrolled pay gap shows. It shows the kind of overall valuation of women, including how they value themselves in society compared to men when it comes to the workforce and the value of their skills within the workforce. And we do also do a list of jobs where the data is controlled to show what this looks like for women and men doing the same jobs. And we see wider pay gaps even within specific occupations where women are making as little as 83 cents compared to what men make when doing the same job with all the same compensable factors controlled. So a lot of this has to do with historical gender norms and expectations for where women are best allocated in society. And that goes back to the idea that women's destiny or fate or value in society is to become mothers. And when they do so, they drop out of the workforce, or that their other options for working are service related or nurture related, having to do with the ideas we have about how women are supposed to show up in society that are historical. And the idea behind measuring the pay gap is to measure how those historical ideas around women's contributions to the world are changing. And as we can see from the numbers, we still have some ways to go on that.
Yeah. And that has such a huge impact. We see that motherhood penalty really on the career of women. So Kelly, this is probably not news to you. This is a part of where you spend your time. Tell us about where you see this come to life in the work that you do, and maybe helping people address issues such as the motherhood penalty.
Yes, I think it's important to note that the motherhood penalty, I think, as your data shows, as well as what sort of experientially I've seen, applies to women who aren't mothers, aren't yet mothers, have no intention of becoming mothers, it is, as Amy, you pointed out, sort of this, right? It's an overall gender bias, and it's a cultural view of things. And when we think about a corporate culture, there's very much sort of institutionalized way of looking at women is they're going to come in and they'll probably work very hard and industriously until they're sort of mid-late 20s. And then we can expect that they'll sort of shift down. And so I personally, in my own Fortune 200 career in a tech organization, was faced with this issue when I went to go promote a young woman who was maybe 6, 7 years into her career into a first-time managerial role. And I was told by the chief communications officer that I reported to, who he very much admired her work, but he said, I just want you to think about whether that's the right promotion, because she just got engaged and she probably will be out having a baby soon. And I was flabbergasted that he said that he actually let the words tumble out of his mouth, as well as he revealed sort of this level of bias. And I said, you know what, that may or may not be the case, but it doesn't matter. I have a job for her to do today, and I'm going to promote her. And in fact, I did. And about 3 years later, she did decide to have a child, and she took maternity leave. And I remember he sort of winked at me and said, well, I told you this was coming. And I said, so what? Right. But even those kinds of subtle things in the workplace that happen, I think we need to just notice them. I'll also just say, in addition to the motherhood penalty, I'm going to say there's the assumption of motherhood, that women also, as we know, tend to be the primary caregiver. So in my case, I was caregiver primarily for my mother in my 30s through her end of life, and then both of my in-laws in my 40s. That's another place where, for some women, they're caregiving on both ends, and I can't tell you how many times in my corporate career in my 30s, as I was taking care of my mother, I was told, "Wow, are you sure you really want to take family medical leave to do that, or kind of this assumption that I wouldn't be up to doing both jobs." And when I finally did take family medical leave for a specified time during the last few months of her end of life, someone had the audacity of telling me that I was committing career cancer, which was particularly offensive because my mother at that time was dying of cancer.
Yeah.
And this was told to me by a woman who was several levels above me. So these kinds of biases and impressions run very deep.
Yes. I think it's very much the workplace not being set up for people to be able to undertake caring responsibilities, regardless of gender and regardless of what those caring responsibilities are. There's the expectation that you will be there, always available at a certain time. And we have made, that we have seen progress made on kind of where work can be done from, forced by the great home working experiment of the pandemic. But there's still a huge amount of work, I think, to be thought about when work can be done. And does it always have to be done in this time slot of 9 till 5 p.m. When you've got so much diversity in the workplace? Not everybody performs well between 9 and 5 p.m. And I know there are all sorts of scheduling disasters, but I think there's just so much we need to think about in terms of allowing people the space to do their work that also allows them to bring their whole self to work and, be able to balance caring responsibilities or other responsibilities they've got. So really important to think about that as a solution.
And can I just offer there for a minute, Ruth? Both the organization does need to hold space for people to figure out what is the best way to contribute outside of very structured, everybody needs to be at 10 o'clock at this particular meeting. So I think it's important to remind employees at every level that they get to express to their employer what ways they best contribute. Some people are early risers. Some people get incredibly creative in the evening. And so while we do have expectations of where people need to be collectively together, in a collaborative sense, we also need to speak up and say where my best contribution will happen. And those include things like, my best contribution is not always on the Zoom screen. I listen better when I turn off the screen and I can, right? Those kinds of things. So 2 things: the employer we would like them to make accommodations, or at least be responsive to the needs of the employee, but also the employee needs to set that expectation of how their contribution is best brought to the foray.
No, that's a great point about, expectations from both sides. And I think the more employees do that, then the more the employer will be forced to respond. Now, Amy, we also break the data down by job level. And so can you take us through that and how we see wider pay gaps as women ascend the corporate ladder?
Yes, and you can infer this from the age data, right? As women get older, you see that pay gap widen, and correspondingly, as women move up the corporate ladder, you also see that pay gap widen, and about in the same rates. So what we see is that women move more slowly up the corporate ladder and in smaller percentages compared to men. So we looked at both the population of men and women at the individual contributor up through the executive level, when we found that men move up faster and in greater quantities than women do. We also break this down by racial group, and we see that women who do become managers, directors, and executives, they make less than men make at the same level. And this is particularly egregious for female executives who make only 72 cents when data are controlled compared to male executives. And when uncontrolled, when data are controlled, they make 94 cents compared to male executives. So that's an interesting take. And it corroborates what Kelly was saying just before about there's like this pushback to promote women into leadership positions, just generally speaking, because of associations that people have, whether consciously or unconsciously, about how dedicated they will be to that work. And then even when they do get those promotions, we see that the equity is not the same. The opportunities are not the same value as what men are being given in terms of similar opportunities.
So, Kelly, this is obviously something that you're dealing with day to day in your work, the challenges women face in becoming leaders in regard to the opportunity gap, the gender norms, and developing executive presence. So what are your thoughts on how you're seeing that, in our data, and then how do we solution this?
Yeah. One of the things that came out in this report, and I sort of highlighted it, and it's such a stark thing that it's a myth that we need to debunk right away. And that is that more education is required to advance in a corporate setting. And in fact, your data shows that that's not the case, that multiple degrees does not accelerate a woman's advancement. And in fact, I don't know if your data showed this or not, but one of the things that I have looked at is that most of the men who are in those sort of the top 2 or 3 tiers in a corporate structure don't have any additional advanced degrees. So, and here in the United States in particular, one of the things that we see a lot of is particularly Black women, but also just women of color in general, tend to be the most highly educated, multiple advanced degrees, MBAs, special CHRO designations, all sorts of sort of advanced education that they've undertaken themselves, and in most cases paid for themselves, under the auspices of this will be the bona fide that will now get me into that next level. And it has not been the case. And one of the things that I always tell women when they come to me and they say, I should probably go get an advanced degree, I say, let's try some other things first, including how you think about yourself as a leader, instead of going and accumulating these sort of proxy things that we think will open a door for us. That does not. That actually, if you think about the gender pay gap, which, by the way, I speak to as a gender pay deficit, right? Even if tomorrow we were all equally paid, there's this historical deficit that we have. But now investing another $20,000, $30,000 in going off and getting a degree across a number of years, that does not ultimately translate into financial ROI. We need to sort of disabuse women of the notion that this is somehow going to change the trajectory for them.
Mm-hmm. And do you help women prepare for how they should behave in an organization, in order to try and fight some of those biases and successfully move up the career ladder, which our data is showing, is not happening at the same speed as men?
Yes. I would say that the number one thing that we work on is that women, and again, your data bears it out, the types of roles that women tend to gravitate to. Women in general tend to have a managerial mindset, a very functionally task-based, role-specific orientation. We're very good at like, give me the job description and I'll start ticking off what all the things are. We're very good at being the sort of functioning in that role. And in fact, I think there's a meme out there about like moms are the managers of the world. Women are we know how to manage a multitude of things. And in fact, I think that's the exact thing that has sort of categorized us and labeled us in that space that keeps us from having a leadership mindset. And a leadership mindset, again, as I said, is not a title, is not a job function, is not a place on the org chart. It's actually how you think about purposing your talent and your contribution. And so whether you have a functional managerial identity or a purposeful impact identity will change how you show up in the organization. And when we think, I am my role, I am my title, I am my function, then we don't take those opportunities to influence things like earnings in an organization. We step back, we say, well, that's not my area of expertise, or that's not my place to say that, or I'll wait until I get a seat at the table. And I have worked with several women just in the last year who have used their position exactly where they are to increase earnings for the women who are in their organization, or for an overall role. I have worked with an HR person in that regard. We can speak about that in a bit.
Great. Okay. Now, I think there's one last data point we wanted to cover, Amy, and that was the data on remote work. What was the study showing there? Because that was a new insight that we brought out this year.
Yeah, I'll jump to that, and then we can jump back to Kelly's commentary on how she's specifically helping HR leaders. So there were two new things added to the report in 2024. One was on the gender pay gap by job seeking status, and the other was by remote work status. So what we're finding is that women who work from home some of the time or all the time have a wider paid gap when data are uncontrolled at 79 cents to the dollar for both of those. Women who work from home some of the time, the pay gap closes to $1, which might be an indicator that workplace flexibility and giving women the choice of where they can be helpful can be instrumental in helping to close those pay gaps, as we have alluded to just previously in this conversation. But those pay gaps also exist because of how much women are being paid for the jobs they do generally, and how much autonomy they have to choose where and how to do that work increases with more highly paid positions that are of more value to the organization. The pay gap narrows for women who go into an office or who go into a job site to 89 cents, but that might be because women are in lower paid jobs for those on-site positions versus those work at home positions. So we can't draw like a concrete conclusion that work from home widens the pay gap, but we can look at it as an influencer in how women are able to choose how they work and how that impacts their pay equity overall versus women who are going into an office. And in both cases, men make more.
Yeah. I thought it was a really interesting insight. It was probably a gut feel that I had about what was going on. When I think, when I look back to pre the pandemic, who was working from home, it was mainly women, more often than not, women that were working from home because they were doing that to balance care responsibilities. And quite often they were prepared to take a pay cut or earn less or stay at a certain level in their pay progression. As a trade-off for having that flexibility of working from home. And now, that whole world has opened up. So many more people can work from home. And that's really kind of where we're seeing this kind of shift in the pay gaps between those, not in the office and those who were either working hybrid or working from home. Now, Kelly, our listeners on this podcast, they're comp or HR pros. So based on kind of what we've talked about today and some of the problems, what can they do to specifically make change happen and address some of these issues?
Yes, one of the things that I know about at least the HR professionals that I have worked with, that I have coached with, or who have brought me into their organizations to do trainings, we know that that is one of those job groups that tends to be more occupied by women. And overall, one of the things that that I have found is that individuals' comfort level in talking about and speaking about money and finances has a direct correlation in their ability to feel comfortable either owning budget in an organization or managing the earnings of the people in their group. And so our our money beliefs and our comfort in speaking about money will either influence our ability to shift this organizationally and individually, or it will keep us sort of stagnating in this place. So that's the first thing, is I would say um, getting comfortable, and this is where that emotional intelligence piece that I talked about is like getting comfortable with our discomfort about money and figuring out why are we uncomfortable about that. I would say the pervasive feeling that I hear from women is a sense of shame. They don't know what other people are earning, and I think that the pay transparency legislation will help with that. But even feeling comfortable speaking with one another about that, sort of demystifying that so that we're being good sharers of information. The other thing is to think again outside of your specific role. So even if you are an HR person or a comp person, but if you think I don't actually have the leverage to go and raise this, the thing I hear most often is, well, I don't want to. Last time we brought that up, I got a lot of pushback, or the C-suite's not interested in that. And I just want to break that down and bring some neutrality around that. Pushback is a term we use to say they weren't immediately receptive. They didn't immediately take our recommendation and run with it. And for us to tire out at the first no, at the first stop sign, is in fact part of the reason that we're here. And we're going to have to, I think there's this anticipatory discomfort, which is, I don't even want to have to go bring this up. And because we're not talking about it throughout the year, it's sort of once a year we bring the data and it's time for conversation. And so we sort of magnify the and create a lot of anxiety for ourselves about it. I want to say, having worked in Fortune 500 in male dominated spaces, particularly for if women are in HR comp, you need to understand that your ability to feel comfortable speaking about this is and taking a back and forth approach. You're going to educate them. Your role, beyond your actual functional role, your role there is to assume a leadership position in influencing an organization. And if it is a male dominated organization, you're going to have to give them some insight into what this means in a very practical way, how it is impacting the women in your organization. I will tell you that my experience with most of those individuals has been, I have educated them and illuminated something for them that was a blind spot, and they're so grateful that I, as a woman at some place in their organization, brought this to them. Right. So I think just emboldening HR professionals to have these conversations and have them more regularly. And if you're not comfortable doing that, that's your work. That's your place of development.
Yeah, that's really valuable, because something I hear a lot when we are interacting with audiences talking about pay transparency or affecting fair pay or measuring pay equity is, we believe in this. We, the HR professionals, the comp professionals, believe in this, but how do we persuade our executives to do this? And I think what you're saying is, just keep asking, just keep telling, just keep sharing the data, like the data, that we have in this amazing report, and, bringing that perspective, so that eventually they can understand and they will listen. Because if you don't, as you say, if you're scared of the pushback, then it's another reason why we won't solve some of these issues. And Amy and I will be here this time next year, and we will be saying that the pay gap is 83 cents on the dollar again, which is not something we want to do, Amy, is it? Yeah. So, any final thoughts, Amy or Kelly, before we close out on this? Really kind of just thinking about some of these key issues that drive pay gaps. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would love to do that first, if you don't mind, Kelly. I think ending with your thoughts would be the most impactful. But I love what you had to say on 2 points. One was the kind of stepping into that leadership role is something that everyone can do regardless of their job title. And I think that there is a compulsion, and I wouldn't even say this just impacts women, but there is a compulsion that people feel like this pressure to submit to whatever the hierarchy is within their organization and do the job that they're being asked to do. And we see this criticism of HR as a function kind of generally for job seekers and employees who say things like HR is just there to protect the company and they don't really care about the equity and the inclusion and the diversity in the organization beyond what numbers get reported up the chain. And I think that this kind of philosophical bent that you're taking here of if you step into the role as a leader, if you're trying to impact change and not just do tasks, that is where that change actually happens. So I really liked hearing that. I think that anecdote is especially powerful. And if we can collect more stories from people, not just women, but from people about how they did that, I think that those case studies would be really interesting from both an equity perspective, but also from a diversity inclusion perspective.
Yeah. And I think that what I heard behind what you said is let's humanize it, right? I think when we think about it as a project, there's a pay gap. Now we sort of grind down into that sort of tactical, managerial, task-based thing. I think it's important for us to not just have the data, but humanize it for the stakeholders who will be those decision makers and explain to them what this actually means on an individual case by case basis. And that might mean having a few women who in the organization who talk about all the different things that they're sort of, having to juggle with this amount of, pay. I want to share with you an example that hopefully will encourage people, no matter where they sit on the org chart. A few years ago, I had a young woman who was just taking her first managerial step in an HR organization in a Fortune 12 organization in Silicon Valley. And she came to me because she said, I want to be influencing on a larger level, no matter where I am in my career, and I want to grow my leadership. She had these aspirations of ascending. And through a series of circumstances, right around the time she joined, her CHRO went out on maternity leave. Her direct manager had moved to another organization, and they were trying to fill a VP. So now think about this. She's brand new in the role, and she is the highest ranking HR person in her function. And so now she's sitting in for the CHRO in the meetings with the executive lead team. And in that meeting, she heard them say that at the end of year, there was going to be a budget surplus. And so then the next week, she had a standing meeting with the CEO of that business unit. And the next week, when she went to go sit down with him, because she was in the room hearing this, she came to him and said, what are you going to do with that surplus? And he said, I don't know. We got to figure out, we got to spend it or we won't get the money next year. And she said, I have an idea for you. And she had always been looking at data. And she said, we have about 330 people in our organization who are severely underpaid. They're underwater. And I've run the numbers, and if we can just take some of that surplus you have and adjust their pay, we'll bring them all up into equity. And his immediate gut response was, I don't want to do that. And she had this moment where she could have said that was pushback, and she left. And she said, why don't you want to do that? She got real curious with him and started to develop this great rapport with him where she said, well, do you understand that? She said, do you understand most of these are women, and then the ones that aren't women are actually immigrants, people who have come to this country to work? And she started humanizing it for him and talking him through it. And he said, yeah, well, okay, thanks for that. And they went on their agenda items. And she said about 15 minutes later, as they were wrapping up, he said, you know what? I like your tenacity and I'm glad you raised this. Go ahead and let's start the process to do this.
That's fantastic. That's a great example of that pushback that we were just talking about. So thank you, Kelly. Well, I kind of feel we could probably sit here for another hour talking about all the different insights in this report. But I'd really like to say very much, Kelly. Thank you for joining Amy and I today to uncover some of what we are finding in our gender pay gap report. We will include a link to how our listeners can find you in the episode summary. And so obviously, listeners, if you want to connect with Kelly, you will be able to find her, but also on LinkedIn, Kelly, I'm assuming.
Yes, active on LinkedIn. And thank you, thank you for Payscale for continuing to raise these issues, particularly around pay gap. I know that for you all, this isn't just a seasonal or thematic thing. It's something you're looking at all the time. And we appreciate your vigilance on this issue.
Thank you very much. Well, that's what we think. That's what Kelly, Amy, and I think. What do you think? If you've got a view on this topic, or you've got a topic that you would like us to discuss, then email us at coffee@payscale.com. And you can now find our podcasts on payscale.com's website as well, under events. So we have a new podcast page there. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Amy, again for joining me to share the results from the report. And we look forward to hearing you on our next podcast. Thank you.